Welcome to our weekly discussion with the Dean of the Political Science world in Virginia, Dr. Bob Holsworth of VCU. Dr. Bob, what's going on with COVID now in the Commonwealth? Are we getting any better?
I think we're different. I'm not so sure we're better. What tends to be happening right now is that when you look at the number of cases that we have, .5%. That's not horrible, but it's not great. So it's kind of this middling performance that we've seen. Our hospitalizations over the last week stayed, I think, relatively steady on a week-by-week basis, somewhere around 1,300 people in hospitals. That's less than we've had at the peak, but far higher than we had maybe a month and a half ago when we had 750 people. And then finally, last week, there were a lot of deaths recorded in Virginia. One of actually our highest weeks that way. But over the last 5 days, that seems to have settled down as well. So ultimately, the pandemic is still here. There's still community spread. It's nowhere near as prevalent as it was once in Northern Virginia, but it's actually spread in other places. We're seeing it in Washington County, Danville, Pennsylvania. And that's complicating the school reopenings, because what we're again seeing is a lot of these superintendents who had intended to be either fully on site or at least partially on site now recommending that maybe we should do some kind of virtual for the first few weeks. And ultimately what we have here, Chris, is this very unusual situation that the schools in Virginia are going to look very different depending upon where you are. Some are going to be on site, some are going to have students in there 2 and 3 days a week, and others are going to be fully virtual for at least 8 weeks, and some maybe for an entire semester. So, I've called time and again, I think we should have a little more state guidance and state leadership here. I'm all for local control, but I think it really looks unusual that there are no kind of rules that basically tell school systems, here's where you should be on site, here's when you should be staggered, here's when you should be fully virtual. We don't seem to have it, and everybody's sort of playing it by ear and doing the best they can, but it's a very challenging situation.
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any guidance. I think we talked about this last week. Because K through 12 is pretty prescriptive in Virginia how to do things. I mean, everything is regulated, how many kids per class, when the day starts, the teachers are very, they're well educated. The teachers are well educated. They're good teachers. I think some of the pedagogy is wrong by having multiple layers of academic talent in the same classroom and having a teacher have to come up with lesson plans for all these different subsets within each class. That being said, because it's so granularly organized and regulated and meticulously overseen, what I'm seeing is a complete lack of that in the organizational structure going into the fall.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that here in Virginia. Other states are a little more prescriptive. But again, I can understand that depending upon the community spread of the virus, there are some communities where on-site would make more sense than online and vice versa. But at the same time, there should be some basic guidance about this. When you're at this percentage, this is what should happen. When you're at that percentage, this is what should happen. We're seeing that, for example, in New York, they have it about, if you're over 3%, you do this. If you're under 3%, you do that. Right. Those kind of things, I think, would be give parents a little more comfort level than they have right now, because I think there's just this high degree of uncertainty. Now, to say, we see the same thing in higher education across the country and even in Virginia, very different programs about what's happening. In terms of college sports, we're seeing that some conferences will play football, other conferences won't. But by and large, what we're seeing is this tremendous patchwork, and it all goes back to the fact that there's not very clear guidance about what to do in what situation.
And there's got to be, it's very confounding for anyone on the ground trying to deliver education, especially for teachers who have to come up with some sort of virtual program. And I don't know what the platform is going to be. I mean, we should have been way ahead of this had the state listened to what your former colleague, the beloved Bill Bosher, had recommended back in 2009, 2010 as we moved forward. And legislation was vetoed twice by McAuliffe, 16 and 17. But we have this uncertainty, which nobody likes, and parents especially, because they want to get their kids going to school. And that's why you're seeing a lot of parents, frankly, leaving the public school system in favor of private school options.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing right now is that the parents are just in this tremendous degree of uncertainty. Most of the parents, or a lot of the parents, let's say, want their kids back. At the same time, for example, if they're listening to the the news over the last few days, they're hearing, well, students can, young people can actually be infected by the virus. They can actually be transmitters of the virus. And there's nothing coming from the state level, which is saying, here's the situation, here's some information. So everybody is trying to react to whatever they're hearing in the last few moments, or whatever they've been thinking over the months. And there's just not a lot of good information being given to parents, which will allow them to inform their choices. So, even within school systems, you're seeing this challenge. Hanover County decided that by and large it would go was on site. It would give parents a virtual option. They basically thought, I think, that maybe 10 or 20% would take the virtual option. Given the news over the last couple of weeks, it's now up to 40% are taking the virtual option. So even within school systems, you're having tremendous differences in how kids are going to be educated in the 3rd grade or the 4th grade or the 5th grade. And it's hard to think at the end of the day, this is going to turn out very, very well.
Well, because we're not going to have any. What we'll have is a patchwork of different school systems applying their local control. This is sort of the downside, if you will, to local control of public education, isn't it? Because there's no real guidance. Everyone's going to be doing their basically laboratory rat testing with how education is going to work. And what is going to happen going forward out of this, I think, is a tremendous shift towards virtual schooling long term.
Well, I think virtual schooling probably for some groups, but I think the challenge right now is that, there are parts of Virginia, Chris, that really don't have very good broadband or very good internet. So the notion of doing virtual schooling is going to be very challenging, very difficult, and it's hard to imagine how those students are going to do well. Then secondly, there are a number of, families who themselves, don't have parents who have been involved in the internet, involved in broadband, involved in the computer system. Often low-income families, often families of ethnic minorities, and it's hard to think that they're not going to fall behind in this situation. So at the end of the year, here's a state in Virginia where we have done an enormous amount of effort to try to ensure that there's basic levels of competence that all students are going to have, that people can reach certain standards and accountabilities. We're not always successful, but this year turns out that it's going to be a completely different experiment, it seems to me.
But it's a shame, really, that we're experimenting with what has become one of the most, pivotal issues in Virginia over the last 20 years, is the development of the education system, K-12 and the higher education, and developing the robustness of both that are leaders in the country, top 5 easily in both systems in the country, which are a part of our economy. Now you have this, we don't know what we're going to do, and it's really going to show the cracks in the system and between the haves and the have-nots. And that's
I think exactly that's going to be the case. It's going to expose the differences that we've been trying to, in some ways, address and trying to overcome. But it's hard to imagine that, given the way that this is proceeding, that some of those differences and some of those distinctions are simply not going to be exacerbated by the situation. And again, you know, what I'd like to see again is I'm a believer in local control, but we, you know, we recognize this at the state. We, in terms of funding, the state funds school systems differently based on their abilities to pay in the local community. And you would think in this instance, we would be trying to give greater guidance to enable those students who are in the most challenging economic circumstances or challenging technological circumstances to succeed, and not to leave these local school systems on their own.
Yeah, because one of the biggest problems I'm hearing from parents is that they might be able to log on the internet, but they don't have the bandwidth to accommodate the entire economy now being online as well as the schools. It's like the reverse of when school systems are out. There's no traffic on the roads in the morning, and then when they're in, you see a lot of traffic on the roads, right? But reverse that to the internet, and that's just what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, you're going to have that, and then you have the, you know, the whole situation of how capable are all parents for dealing with assisting students when they need to be assisted. If they're having trouble accessing the teachers and the information on the internet. You know, some people are pretty good at 7th and 8th grade math, but in some places that gets to be pretty challenging for a lot of parents. They could be trying to give that kind of assistance.
Yeah.
So I'm just really worried about how the social distinctions that we already see in Virginia, that we try to address in the educational system, won't be overcome this year, but may actually be exacerbated.
Yeah, I think they'll be exacerbated and accelerated with the velocity, frankly, that we're not used to seeing. Let's switch over, we can, how this is going to manifest itself going into the elections. Do you see this impacting the election, and where do you see the elections in 2020 shaping up in Virginia?
Well, certainly at the presidential and senatorial levels, I just can't imagine that what we're seeing right now are going to change very much. Donald Trump's not popular in Virginia. He's very unpopular in Northern Virginia. That's not going to change. I think what is going to change is that Virginia was seen as a battleground state for the past 3 elections. I don't think it's going to be seen that way. I don't think we're going to see a lot of advertising directed here. My sense is that the Democrats feel that this is a state that's not going to be very competitive, and I believe the Republicans feel much the same way. A similar thing I think is going to happen with the senatorial election. Daniel Gate has a great the key elections in Virginia are really those 3 congressional races that I think are in some ways up for grabs. The 2 seats held by Democrats, Spanberger and Luria, and then the Riggleman seat where Bob Good was able to win the rest of the nomination for him. Democrats have what looks to be a really excellent candidate in Cameron Webb, but that's a very, very conservative district. So I think that's where the effort is going to be. In the 7th district, that's the district that Donald Trump carried. Republicans may be a little behind the 8 ball because it took them so long to get a candidate and raise money. And Abigail Spanberger is already on television. But my guess is that those are the 3 key races that we're going to see in Virginia. I'm not sure they're going to be, those races are going to be determined by what's happening at the state level as much as next year's gubernatorial race is going to be impacted by all of these local issues that we're seeing in the Commonwealth.
So let's play that out. Do you see anything on the horizon in the state being impacted? What's going on? We have, you know, the lawsuit on the NRA. Of course, we have that's a big factor in rural constituencies. You have a number of, I think it's upwards of 80,000 guns that were purchased in last month alone in Virginia. I mean,
there's been a lot of guns in the last year in Virginia.
Right. Well, I mean, this is where it's coming. You know, how does this play out?
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I think it plays out, you know, sort of more locally than statewide in some ways. That certainly that's going to energize the rural base, but they've been energized before, and the challenge is for the Republicans is to overcome the challenges they've had in the suburbs. Ralph Northam, Tim Kaine carried the 10 most populous jurisdictions in Virginia. The Republicans are going to have a candidate that finds some way of both uniting the pro-business wing with the more socially conservative wing. They've had challenges with that. Maybe Kirk Cox is the guy who can do it. But by and large, in a statewide race, they're going to have that. The Democrats' challenge is that in the past, there's typically been this pathway to the nomination that either the lieutenant governor or the attorney general would get it if the party had both members there. They don't have that this time. Justin Fairfax is running. I'm not sure he would probably be seen as the fourth leading candidate now, or in some ways, or the third. I'm not sure what Mark Herring is going to do. He said he was going to run early on. Now we don't see much evidence of that in terms of fundraising. So the Democrats are going to have their own contest between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the more, I think, center-left wing of the party, and we'll see how that plays out. My sense is that until the Republicans come up with a candidate who can actually speak to the suburbs, it almost doesn't matter what the Democrats do, because the demography is sort of destiny there. And the question is whether Kirk Cox could get a nomination and whether he would be perceived as a candidate who could be more successful in Northern Virginia than we've seen recently.
That demography is not necessarily towards, that you mentioned, not necessarily towards minorities. It's also the demography of women in the suburbs and college-educated men in the suburbs trending towards, frankly, being not Republican versus being Democrat. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, that I think is what's happening. I mean, certainly with the college-educated and post-college educated women. I remember years ago listening to James Carville, the Democratic strategist, and they asked him about the white working class. And he said, well, we're not doing as well, obviously. He said, but if you go to any university town and go to the graduate classes at night, he says, they're all women and they're all ours. And so that's kind of the challenge for the Republican Party nationally. It's a challenge for them in Virginia in particular, because this is a state, when you get up to Northern Virginia, where people are extraordinarily highly educated. I think as a state, we probably have about 25% of the population who have college degrees. When you talk about voters, that's probably higher. And then when you go up to Northern Virginia, you're getting 44, 45, 50% of the population are holding college degrees. And they vote in large numbers. And by and large, the other thing that's happened, Chris, is that vote has become increasingly nationalized.
Right.
Their media is not a Richmond media for the most part. Their media is a national media. They're in some ways vote on what I would call metropolitan Washington issues. Certainly transportation figures into that, but other than that, their vote is about the national environment as much as it is this. And then the other factor we have to see is, how does this off-year election play into Virginia again? Because what we had seen in the past is we held these off-year elections because we didn't want our elections to be nationalized. We wanted to have elections about Virginia. But what's occurred is that because we're one of like 2 states that have a gubernatorial election next year, you get nationalized, and all the national money pours into Virginia. And what's occurred is that the Democrats have been able in recent years to use that very successfully to counter the Republican advantage they might have with Virginia business and Virginia business money. So that's another challenge that the Republicans face, is the nationalization of even the state elections in Virginia in these off years, where tons of national money are pouring in. And at the moment, that money is dominated by Democrats.
Right. And now if you look at the way the trend line is, then certainly Biden has to be considered a strong favorite to win the election. But they've seen some narrowing of the polling averages, and maybe the tide is starting to shift there a little bit. And I think the polls will get closer because the Trump folks will have to do better at defining Joe Biden as we get closer to the election to make it the binary choice. But I'm not trying to, because every time
I think you're absolutely correct on that.
Well, every time you mention, the polls and the data, people go, oh, the polls are wrong. The polls aren't wrong. The modelings are always different. But the reality is, for Republicans, they have this double-edged sword here in Virginia going into this election, because if they want to win the governor's mansion, the best way to do that is to have Joe Biden in the presidency, and
Oh,
then
there's no doubt.
and be able to run against him and nationalize the election next year against the Democrats national.
Yeah, I've talked to some Republicans who've toyed with the idea of running for governor, and they tell you that they have to wait until after they wanted to wait until after the election,
Right.
largely because they felt if Donald Trump's the nominee, there's no case, and that's what I thought Kirk Cox tried to do last week. He tried to freeze anybody else who might want that to sort of run as sort of the pro-business candidate, the candidate who is a little more pragmatic than you're going to see out of some of the other candidates who are said they're running or thinking of running on that front. And Cox, I think, could begin to raise money from the Virginia business community this way. But if Donald Trump managed to be the president again, I can't imagine that a Republican would have a chance in Virginia.
I don't see that at all as a possibility. The overwhelming turnout in Northern Virginia alone would probably be enough to win the rest of the state, period. I mean, if you just
Yeah.
the sheer
Tim Kaine carried Fairfax County against Cory Booker by 221,000 votes.
Corey Stewart.
Corey Stewart, yeah, excuse me. Cory Booker wouldn't like that.
Yeah, it's amazing how the torch rally in Charlottesville didn't bring out more Republicans in Northern Virginia. It just continues to shock and dismay observers in the Commonwealth, right? What, since we're transitioned to that, how do you see the General Assembly special session kicks off a week from today? We've had a number of problems for the Northern administration, specifically with the Virginia Parole Board. How do you see this playing out?
Well, clearly Republicans, see a couple of opportunities here. Most of them related in some fashion to law and order. Certainly they're looking at the governor's emergency powers and about whether or not the governor should be able to have these emergency powers in perpetuity or whether there should be a time limit. What's happening with sort of the release of prisoners and the like. So the Republicans are looking at that. The Democrats, on their hand, are really trying to focus on, I think, criminal justice reform in particular, and remember, the whole purpose of this special session is supposedly the budget, but it's going to last a little longer, and there are going to be other issues that come involved. I'm wondering whether or not we're going to actually ever see we're going to see anything about the election as well, in 2020, and particularly. Whether there's going to be anything more said about absentee ballots and mail-in voting and the like come forward. But at least right now, I think the Republicans believe that Northern's taken a little bit of hit because of the patchwork response that we've seen on the coronavirus. His poll numbers are still pretty good there, but they're not as high as they were. They believe that there's certainly some opportunity on law and order. By and large, people frustrated with some of the protests, people frustrated with the release of prisoners, and people thinking that the Democrats have really gone too far to the left. And I think that's the kind of argument that the Republicans want to set up in Virginia in the long term, that the Democrats have become captured too much by the progressive wing and the left wing of the party, and they're taking steps both economically and in terms of law enforcement that are inconsistent with where Virginia wants to be. To get back to the election, I would say one thing I would mention, and we haven't heard much talk about this, is administering an election in November is going to be an extraordinarily difficult task while this pandemic is going on, Chris. Just think of who the election workers are
Right.
in almost every community.
Right.
They're by and large, I think, retirees, people from 65 to 75. In most communities, they have to work the entire day. They get there at 5:30 in the morning. They work to 7:30 or 8 in the evening. And a lot of them are not going to show up on election day. So the question is, community by community, how many polling places are we going to be able to have? How are we going to have election workers? What are we going to say about the mail? What about this idea that you can, ballots can be counted until Friday after the election? There's a whole set of issues that are emerging here. I'd be surprised if no one brings any of this stuff up at the special session, because I think, you know, and I'm not talking about fraud. I'm simply talking about the basic capacity to administer an election so that people feel comfortable in going to the polls, not waiting forever, knowing where the polling place is, having poll workers there. Every community in Virginia is going to have to start thinking about this. And if we're looking at some of the chaos that we spoke about in education, what's going to happen when we get to an election in just a few months? And I'd like to see far more planning about this, again, from sort of at the state level, that's visible. I'm sure they're doing it, you know, with the local registrars, but I think everybody needs to be much more comfortable about this election than I am right now.
Yeah, it seems to me that having this special session is turning into a fairly big risk for the Democrats. I mean, they've had everything going for them in Virginia going right, largely because they've been organized, well funded, but also because the Republicans just can't seem to solve any problem or get out of their own way and create a counter narrative of any substance. Now you're giving the Republicans a platform. You have the parole board issue. You've got the elections coming up. You got schools not operating well. It could turn into a dysfunctional problem for the Democrats, don't you think?
Yeah, it could. If I think from the Republican side, they need a spokesperson who can articulate this, put this into a coherent narrative, and not kind of get in the way of the narrative. You know,
Right.
You know, we're talking about Amanda Chase and her mask, or whether she's not wearing the mask, and whether she has a doctor's note saying she doesn't have to wear one, and what's happening in restaurants in Harrisonburg. Those are diversions, I think, from the key issues that could actually help Republicans get back on track in Virginia. So what I'm interested in seeing there is who emerges in the legislature as a spokesperson. And now that Kirk Cox is considering a run for governor, does he try to find a way to be out front and to really be a spokesperson for the Virginia Republican Party on these issues going forward there? Because at least in terms of education, I don't know what the Republican position is right now, per se. I mean, I don't know if they have one, if they've articulated it, and the like. I think they have on the law enforcement criminal justice issue, and usually if an election's about that, Republicans do better than Democrats. But by and large, I'm not sure that's where people are. I think they're with two things right now. I think they're with education. I think we're at the coronavirus, and they're about Donald Trump.
Right, and Kirk Cox, as a former teacher, brings that opportunity for the Republicans to have him be the lead spokesperson going into the school session. But Amanda Chase appears to be, unfortunately for Republicans, the face of the Republican Party statewide. She's the only declared candidate for governor, and every time she goes out in public, she becomes an embarrassment for the Republican Party. With her recent campaigning with Ted Nugent, who has never disavowed his pedophilia in the past, to at least to my knowledge and to my research, and then she goes to a restaurant in Harrisonburg and threatens to sue the owner for making her wear a mask in his establishment. I mean, this is the face of the Republican Party right now, unfortunately for them.
Right, and that's the problem. They need a new spokesperson. And as I said, and if Kirk Cox is really doing more than just exploring a run for governor, and he wants to do this, I mean, this is his opportunity, because the media will look for somebody to be that party spokesperson, to be someone they can turn to when they really have a concern. And it's going to be interesting to see whether Kirk uses this session, where he's still a delegate, to become the visible face of the party in actually talking about these issues and proposing an alternative to some of the Democratic positions right now, which the Republicans don't have. And as you said, if it's Amanda Chase, this is another debacle in waiting for the party.
Right, someone's got to step up. So let's turn to our attention quickly, if we can, to the Democrats. They also have a number of people looking to be the leader of the party going to 2021. You're going to have Jennifer Carroll Foy as a delegate. She's running for governor. You have Senator Jennifer McClellan in the Senate running for governor. But you also have Candace in the House running for lieutenant governor. How do you see this jockeying for position out of the gate going into 2021 in the special session?
Well, I think what you're going to see in the special session there is, again, the tension or division, sometimes you might say, that can arise between the progressive wing of the party and the center left of the party. For the most part, in the 2020 session, they agreed on 90%. There was such pent-up Democratic demand for things that immigration reform, minimum wage, you had a whole set of issues across the spectrum where the Democrats had, a generation of pent-up demand where they could agree. At the same time, there were a lot of places where they didn't agree. They didn't agree about regulation of dominion, for example. They didn't agree necessarily on assault weapons ban. There were 4 or 5 people there. They don't necessarily agree on a host of business issues about whether they should be pro-business, pro-labor, right to work being in the middle of that. So you're going to see folks like Jennifer Carroll Foy, come back with talking about, mandatory unpaid leave, paid sick leave. Those kind of issues are going to come up. And Carol Foy, she has some money behind her. She has Michael Bills and Sonia Smith have given, I think, more than $500,000 to that campaign as well. You have Terry McAuliffe, who wants to campaign largely on, as he did previously, I think, which is by and large pro-economic development on the business side and being sort of a rock-solid Democrat on liberal Democrat on social issues. And you have Jen McClellan trying to gain sort of, some middle ground of getting progressive votes and also at the same time getting some of the more, center-left votes of the Democratic side. So that's how I think we're going to see this play out in the Democratic side during the campaign. You're going to see the progressive activists, I think, be more energetic. The people who want to talk about inequality, who want to talk about stricter regulation of business, who want to be more pro-labor, those folks are going to be very, very visible. More regulation of dominion, more, sort of clearer commitment to renewable energy. And they're going to be visible. I don't know if they're going to win, but by and large, they're going to have a lot of the energy. And I think the center-left Democrats are going to have to take some steps toward them in order to get a nomination.
Well, how do you think this is going to play out during session with all these different factions fighting? I mean, if this becomes this has a possibility of unwinding for the Democrats, turning into just a big brawl, and the Republicans going, see, I told you so. We're trying to solve law and order in the streets. We're trying to solve education, and you guys can't agree to these other things. Why are we here? I just see it as a real problem for the Democrats potentially blowing.
Yeah, the only thing about that is that, in the short term, there's not an election taking place, I think, that is going to be determined by what the Democrats did in the special session right now. So that gets kind of kicked into next year, and by that time, if there was some division in the special session, we'll see if the Republicans can take advantage of that a year down the road. So I'm probably not as pessimistic about how this is going to play out for the Democratic side. At the same time, I do think that by and large, something that was, called to deal simply with the budget is going to have implications far beyond the budget in terms of the issues that emerge.
Yeah, I think because of the danger that this session poses, having been in those special sessions many times, I think what the reaction from the leadership is going to be get in and get out.
Right. They're going to try to do that as quickly as they can.
Absolutely.
Because they don't want to keep opening it up for issue upon issue to emerge that largely they're not controlling.
Lastly, Dr. Bob Holsworth, how difficult is this Virginia Parole Board issue for the Northam administration? It seems like it could spin out of control.
Yeah, I think this is a serious problem, I think, for them. I mean, that it has not been, I don't think it's been handled all that well. We have a report that they say the legislature is going to see, but was heavily redacted. We have, a real challenge. And I mean, that's the kind of issue that provides an opportunity and an opening for a statewide candidate a year from now. So it's not just a question for Northam, it's a question for Democrats there, because it's a question of the integrity of the officialdom, you might say, that, including people they've appointed. And so at the end of the day, that is the kind of issue that can be a challenge in a statewide campaign. We haven't seen these kind of issues that actually dominate state campaigns in quite some time. But if I had to say, what's the most challenging issue the Northam administration has faced since the entire yearbook and the blackface incident, this is probably it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bob Holsworth. Always great to tap into your brain and have you put all the pieces together for us so we can start thinking clearly. Politics gets good and jumbled up here in the Commonwealth. We appreciate your insights and wisdom. Thank you as always. We'll see you next
Take care, Chris. Have a good week.